Sometimes life doesn't just knock you down. It takes everything you've built and leaves you standing in the ruins. For Nolan Reyes, a 46-year-old single father, that moment came when he lost his job and his apartment in the same month. He returned to his hometown with nothing but his truck and his dignity, heading straight for the forest where a massive oak tree had fallen years ago. The neighbors watched him carry wood and old tools into those woods, shaking their heads at what they saw as a broken man's foolish dream. But Nolan wasn't running away. He was building something beneath that fallen oak, something the town would mock until the day it saved their lives. Before we continue, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The truck's engine ticked as it cooled in the early November air, each metallic ping a reminder of how far Nolan had driven and how little fuel remained in the tank. He sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring through the windshield at the town limit sign that read, Millfield Creek, population 3,147. The number hadn't changed since he'd left at 19. Diploma in hand and dreams bigger than the valley could contain. 27 years later, those dreams had shrunk to fit in the cab of a 15-year-old Ford, with rust eating through the wheel wells and everything he owned packed in the bed under a tarp. His phone buzzed in the cup holder. Fiona's name lit up the screen. He let it go to voicemail, already knowing what she'd say. The same thing she'd been saying for 3 weeks now, since the eviction notice had been taped to their door, and he'd had to explain to their 8-year-old daughter why Daddy couldn't afford their apartment anymore. The voicemail notification appeared. Nolan didn't listen to it. He'd call Penny tonight, like he did every night, and hear her small voice asking when she could visit his new place. Soon, he'd told her last time. Real soon, sweetheart. He reached for the wallet in his back pocket and flipped it open. Behind his expired driver's license and a credit card he'd stopped using when it maxed out, he found what he was looking for. A drawing done in crayon by small, determined hands. Their old apartment, rendered in purple and yellow, with 2 stick figures standing in front. One tall, one small. Me and Daddy's house written across the top in Penny's careful second-grade printing. He traced his thumb over the waxy lines, then closed the wallet and stepped out of the truck. The air smelled different here. Cleaner maybe, or just older. Pine and creek water and wood smoke from someone's chimney. Nolan pulled his jacket tighter and walked toward Main Street, his boots crunching on gravel. A few cars passed, their drivers glancing his way with the casual curiosity of people who recognized an unfamiliar vehicle. He kept his head down. The diner hadn't changed. Same red vinyl booths visible through the window. Same neon sign buzzing Bryn's Place in cursive letters. Nolan pushed through the door and was hit with the smell of coffee and bacon grease. A woman in her 50s looked up from behind the counter, her grey-streaked hair pulled back in a ponytail. Her eyes widened slightly. Nolan Reyes, she said, not quite a question. Morning, Bryn? She set down the coffee pot she'd been holding and studied him with the kind of frank assessment only small-town business owners could manage. Heard you might be coming back. Your brother mentioned it. Of course, Garrett had mentioned it. Probably told half the town his failure of a younger brother was slinking home with his tail between his legs. Just passing through, Nolan said, though they both knew it was a lie. Bryn wiped her hands on her apron.
Coffee's fresh.
Sit wherever you like. The diner was mostly empty, too late for breakfast, too early for lunch. Nolan slid into a booth by the window and accepted the mug Bryn brought over. She didn't ask if he wanted anything else, just left the pot on the table and returned to the counter. It was the kind of quiet kindness he'd forgotten existed. Across the way, Virgil's Hardware was doing steady business. Nolan recognized the owner through the window. Virgil Brenner, a man who'd been old when Nolan was young, and age hadn't softened him any. The bell above the diner door chimed. An elderly woman entered, moving slowly with a cane. Bryn greeted her by name, Constance, and guided her to a table. Nolan's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from Fiona. Penny keeps asking when she can see you. What should I tell her? He typed back, working on it. Few more weeks. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No response came. He finished his coffee and left a $5 bill on the table. more than the coffee cost, less than his dignity required. Bryn caught his eye as he headed for the door. "You need anything," she said. "You know where to find me." It wasn't quite an offer of help, but it wasn't indifference either. Nolan nodded his thanks and stepped back outside. The hardware store was his next stop. The bell jangled as he entered, and Virgil looked up from his register with the expression of a man who'd just discovered something unpleasant on his shoe. "Help you?" Virgil asked, though his tone suggested he'd rather not. "Just looking," Nolan said. He walked the aisles slowly, taking inventory. 2x4s, plywood sheets, boxes of nails and screws, coils of rope, tarps, hand tools. Everything was priced higher than the city stores, but that was the cost of convenience. Nolan ran calculations in his head, what he'd need immediately, what could wait, what he might scavenge or improvise. "You planning on building something?" Virgil asked, appearing at the end of the aisle with his arms crossed. "Maybe. Heard you lost your job. Heard you lost your place too. Small towns. Nothing stayed private for long." "Heard right," Nolan said evenly. Virgil's mouth twisted into something that might have been sympathy on a more generous face. "Credits cash only here. No exceptions. Wasn't asking for exceptions." Nolan left the hardware store empty-handed, but not empty-headed. He knew what he needed now, and he knew he'd have to find another way to get it. The road out of town wound through farmland that had been worked by the same families for generations. Nolan drove slowly until he reached a dirt path marked by a weathered mailbox that read Pruitt. He'd called ahead from a gas station payphone, and the old farmer had agreed to see him. Mr. Pruitt was waiting on the porch, a man in his 70s with shoulders that hadn't quite surrendered to age and hands that still knew the meaning of work. "You're the Reyes boy," Mr. Pruitt said as Nolan climbed out of the truck. "Yes, sir. Appreciate you seeing me. Your daddy worked on my barn roof once. 20 years back, maybe more. Did good work. Didn't cut corners." The old man studied Nolan with eyes that had evaluated livestock and weather and men for 7 decades. "You any good with your hands?" "I was a carpenter for 18 years before the company folded." Mr. Pruitt nodded slowly. "What is it you want from me?" "Permission to cross your land. There's a section of forest on the far edge, where the old oak came down. I'd like to set up there for a while. You planning on living rough out there? Planning on building something?" "A shelter. Maybe more if I can manage it." The farmer was quiet for a moment. "That oak's been down 5 years. Must be 30 feet through at the base, hollow from lightning strike. Good wood, though. Solid where it ain't rotted. That's what I'm counting on. What's your plan when winter really hits?" Nolan met his gaze steadily. "Build fast and build right." Something shifted in the old man's expression. Not quite approval, but recognition. "There's an old barn on the back 40, mostly collapsed. Some of the wood's still good, if you can separate it from the rot. You're welcome to it for $50. Fair price for salvage. $50. Nolan had 43 in the bank and another 15 in his pocket. "I can give you 30 now and 20 next week." "30 now is fine. Bring the other 20 when you can." The farmer extended his hand. "Build it right, son. That's all that matters." They shook on it, and Nolan felt something loosen in his chest. Not hope exactly, but possibility. He spent the rest of the afternoon hiking to the fallen oak. When he found it, he stood in silence for a long moment. It was massive, 35 feet through at its widest point, the bark weathered grey and split where weather had worked its transformation. Lightning had hollowed out a section near the base, tall enough for a man to stand in and wide enough to suggest possibilities. Nolan walked the length of the fallen giant, running his hands over the wood, testing for rot, checking for structural integrity. Most of the trunk was solid. The hollow extended maybe 15 feet back before the wood closed up again. It was dry inside, protected from rain by the bulk of the tree itself. He could work with this. That night, he slept in the truck bed under the tarp, parked on the edge of Mr. Pruitt's property. The stars were clearer here than they'd been in the city. Nolan lay on his back and thought about his daughter, about the promise he'd made to her, to himself, to the man his father had raised him to be. He'd been a carpenter most of his adult life. He knew how to take raw materials and transform them into something useful, something that lasted. Now he would build the most important thing he'd ever made, a home. Not just shelter from the weather, but proof that a man could fall and still find his feet. His phone buzzed one more time before the battery died. A text from Penny. "Good night, Daddy, I love you." He typed back quickly before the screen went dark. "Love you too, sweetheart. Sweet dreams." Then he pulled the sleeping bag tighter around himself and closed his eyes, already counting the hours until dawn when the real work could begin. The first 3 weeks passed in a rhythm of work that Nolan had almost forgotten he was capable of. Up before dawn, hiking to the oak with whatever tools he could carry, working until the light failed, then back to the truck for cold meals and sleep that came hard and dreamless. His hands developed new calluses over old ones. His shoulders ached in ways that reminded him of his first years in construction, when his body was still learning what it meant to work. He'd established a basic camp, a tarp stretched between trees for cover when it rained, a fire pit ringed with stones, a makeshift table made from a sheet of plywood balanced on tree stumps. The hollow of the oak had become his workshop and his sanctuary, a space that smelled of old wood and earth and possibility. He'd cleared the debris from inside, hauled out decades of accumulated leaves and rot, scraped away moss until he reached solid wood. The interior walls of the hollow were surprisingly sound, scarred by the lightning strike, but structurally intact. He'd begun fitting salvaged boards from Mr. Pruitt's barn, creating a floor that was level and solid, the kind of foundation that could support walls. The work was slow. Every board had to be assessed, measured, cut by hand with a saw that grew duller with each passing day. Every nail had to count because he couldn't afford to waste a single one. But slowly, incrementally, the hollow was transforming from a dead tree into the skeleton of something livable. Then Fiona called. Nolan was fitting a support beam when his phone rang, the sound jarring in the forest quiet. He almost didn't answer. His battery was perpetually low, and he'd been saving it for his nightly calls with Penny. But Fiona rarely called during the day, unless something was wrong. "Nolan." Her voice was tight, controlled in the way that meant she was furious. "We need to talk." He set down his hammer and walked outside, where the reception was better. "What's going on?" "What's going on is that I just had a very interesting conversation with someone from Millfield Creek. Apparently my ex-husband is living in the woods, like some kind of hermit." The word stung more than it should have. "I'm not a hermit. I'm building what exactly?" "A fantasy." "Because that's what people are saying. Nolan, they're saying you've lost your mind. People who haven't seen what I'm doing. I haven't seen what you're doing either." Her voice cracked slightly, anger giving way to something that sounded like fear. "Penny keeps asking when she can visit your new place. What am I supposed to tell her? That Daddy's living in a tree?" "It's not like that." "Then what is it like?" "Explain it to me, because from where I'm standing, this looks like a breakdown." Nolan closed his eyes, pinching the bridge of his nose. Through the phone, he could hear traffic in the background. Fiona was probably on her lunch break, sitting in her car outside the office where she worked as a paralegal. Her life had continued in straight lines, while his had spiraled into chaos. "I'm building a shelter," he said carefully. "A real one. Walls, roof, floor. A place where Penny can visit. Where we can, in the woods. Under a fallen tree." "It's more than that, is it?" She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had gone cold. "I've been patient, Nolan. I've let you have your time to figure things out. But I have a responsibility to our daughter, and I won't let her be part of whatever this is." "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I'm talking to a lawyer. About custody." The words hit like a physical blow. Nolan sat down hard on a nearby stump, his legs suddenly unsteady. "Fiona, don't. I have to. You see that, right? You've lost your job, you've lost your apartment, and now you're living in the forest. What kind of environment is that for a child?" "I'm working on it. I just need time." "How much time? Another month, 2? Winter's coming, Nolan. What's your plan when the temperature drops and the snow starts?" "I'll have it finished by then." "You'll have a tree finished?" "A home," he said, his voice harder than he intended. "I'll have a home." She sighed, and he could picture her expression, that mix of exasperation and pity he'd seen too many times in their last year of marriage. "I'm giving you 2 months. If you don't have stable housing by then, real housing, not whatever you're building in the woods, I'm filing for full custody. Preston thinks I should do it now, but I'm trying to be fair. Preston, of course. Fiona's boyfriend. The real estate agent, with the pressed shirts and the sensible sedan, and the life that looked exactly like what Nolan's was supposed to have been. 2 months, Fiona repeated. I'm sorry, but that's the best I can do. She hung up before he could respond. Nolan sat holding the dead phone, staring at nothing. 2 months. 60 days, to build something that would convince a judge he was a fit father, that he could provide a proper home for his daughter. 60 days to prove he wasn't crazy, wasn't broken, wasn't the failure everyone thought he was. The sun had moved while he'd been on the phone, shadows lengthening across the forest floor. He looked at the oak, at the work he'd already done, at the work that remained. It had been a survival project before, something to keep him busy and housed while he figured out his next move. But now it was something else entirely. It was a custody battle fought with hammer and nails instead of lawyers and courtrooms. It was his last chance to keep his daughter in his life. It was everything. Nolan stood up slowly, his phone forgotten in his pocket. He walked back into the hollow of the oak and picked up his tools. His hands were shaking slightly, adrenaline mixing with fear and determination in equal measure. 2 months. He had 2 months to build the impossible. That evening he drove to his mother's old house. He'd been avoiding it since he'd arrived in town, unwilling to face the memories or his brother who now owned it. But if he was going to finish the shelter in time, he needed more than salvaged barnwood and hand-me-down tools. He needed the equipment his father had left behind. The house looked smaller than he remembered, the white paint graying and peeling in places. Garrett's car was in the driveway, a newer model, practical and clean. Nolan parked on the street and walked up the path he'd run down as a child, his boots heavy on the concrete steps. He knocked, waited. Garrett opened the door, surprise registering on his face before settling into something cooler. Nolan. Garrett. They looked at each other for a moment, these two brothers who'd once been close and now were strangers, connected only by blood and shared history. Garrett had gotten their father's build, tall and broad-shouldered. But he'd gotten their mother's caution, her need for security and respectability. He worked as an accountant, had for 20 years, lived in the house they'd grown up in because it was paid off and practical. "What do you want?" Garrett asked, not unkindly but not warmly either. "Dad's tools. I know Mom kept them in the garage. I thought, if you're not using them, you want to borrow Dad's tools. Not borrow. Keep, if that's all right. I need them." Garrett leaned against the doorframe, studying him. "Heard you're living in the woods. Building something?" "That's right. Heard it's a tree house or something. That people are talking. People always talk. They're saying you've lost it, Nolan, that you're having some kind of breakdown. What do you think?" Garrett was quiet for a moment, then shrugged. "I think you always did things your own way. Sometimes it worked out. Sometimes it didn't. Can I have the tools or not?" His brother sighed, then stepped back from the door. "They're in the garage. Take what you need, but I'm not letting you stay here. I've got my own life, my own. I'm not asking to stay." Good. The garage smelled like motor oil and sawdust, exactly as it had when their father was alive. The tools were stored in the same place they'd always been. The workbench along the back wall, pegboard with hand tools hung in precise order, power tools on shelves wrapped in canvas to protect them from dust. Their father had been meticulous about his equipment, treating each piece like it was sacred. Nolan ran his hand along the workbench, memories rising unbidden. His father teaching him to hold a hammer, to sight down a board for straightness, to respect the wood and the craft. "Measure twice, cut once," he'd say. "Do it right the first time, and you'll never have to do it again." He found what he was looking for in a wooden box on the lower shelf, his father's carpenter's level. It was old brass fittings tarnished with age, but the vials were still clear and the bubble still true. His father had used this level on every job for 30 years, had passed it down from his own father before that. Nolan lifted it carefully, feeling its familiar weight in his hands. "He'd want you to have it," Garrett said from the doorway. Nolan turned, surprised. His brother's expression had softened slightly, memory working on him too. "Dad always said you had the gift," Garrett continued. "Said you understood wood the way some people understand music or numbers. He was proud of that. Was he? You know he was." Nolan looked down at the level, at the worn brass and the careful craftsmanship. His father had died 5 years ago, heart attack while working on a deck. Gone between one hammer swing and the next, the way he probably would have wanted it. They'd buried him with his favorite chisel in his pocket, and Nolan had thought at the time about all the conversations they'd never had, all the things he'd never said. "I'm going to build something Dad would be proud of," Nolan said quietly. "In a tree? In a fallen oak?" "There's a difference." Garrett shook his head but didn't argue. "Take whatever you need. Just be careful, all right? I don't want to have to bury another family member." They loaded the truck in silence. The level, a circular saw that still worked. A box of drill bits, a square, several clamps, and a hand plane their father had restored from a flea market find. Good tools, well maintained, ready for work. As Nolan was closing the tailgate, Garrett spoke again. "You really think you can do this? Build a place in 2 months?" "I have to, because of Penny. Because of everything." His brother nodded slowly. "Then I hope you make it." "I really do." It was the closest thing to a blessing Nolan was likely to get. He drove back to the forest with his father's tools rattling in the truck bed, and when he reached his camp, he carefully carried the level to the oak. He placed it on the floor he'd built, watching the bubble settle true and level between the lines. His father was gone. His marriage was over. His job, his apartment, his old life, all of it was gone. But he still had his hands and his knowledge and his daughter's love. He still had wood and tools and determination. He still had the lessons his father had taught him about building things that lasted. 2 months felt like forever, and no time at all. Nolan picked up his hammer and got back to work. The circular saw screamed through lumber, drowning out the forest sounds. Nolan guided the board with steady hands, letting the tool do the work, watching the cut lines stay true. His father's voice echoed in his head. "Let the saw cut. Don't force it. The blade knows what to do." 4 weeks into the project, and the hollow of the oak was beginning to look like more than just a cleared-out tree. The floor was complete. Salvaged boards fitted tight and level, sanded smooth enough that Penny wouldn't get splinters when she visited. Interior support beams ran along the curved walls, following the natural arch of the tree, creating a framework that would hold the partition walls he planned to install. On a piece of salvaged cardboard spread across his makeshift work table, Nolan had drawn his blueprint. Not fancy architectural drawings, but precise measurements and detailed sketches that showed every angle, every joint, every space. The shelter would have 3 distinct areas: a sleeping section in the back where the hollow was deepest, a central living space with room for a small table and chairs, and a kitchen area near the entrance where he'd build the stone fireplace. Ventilation holes would run along the top of the oak's interior, hidden but functional, drawing smoke up and out while keeping rain from coming in. It was ambitious, maybe too ambitious for the time he had left. But Nolan had learned in 18 years of carpentry that the only way to build something right was to see it complete in your mind first, then work backward to figure out how to make it real. He set down the saw and wiped sweat from his forehead despite the November chill. The pile of cut lumber beside him represented 3 trips to Mr. Pruitt's collapsed barn. Hours of pulling nails from old boards, sorting good wood from rot. His hands were covered in fresh cuts and old calluses. His shoulders ached from carrying timber through the forest, but the work felt good, purposeful. A voice called out from the tree line. "Nolan?" He turned to see Bryn picking her way through the underbrush, carrying a thermos and a paper bag. She'd started visiting once a week, always bringing coffee and day-old pastries from the diner, never asking for anything in return. "Thought you might need a break," she said, stepping into the clearing. "Appreciate it." She handed him the thermos and looked past him at the oak. Her eyes widened slightly. "Nolan, you've made real progress." He followed her gaze, trying to see it through fresh eyes. The floor, the support beams, the beginning of wall frames. It didn't look like much yet, but the bones were there. The structure that would hold everything else. Still a long way to go, he said. How long do you have? 5 weeks, maybe 6 if I'm lucky. Bryn was quiet for a moment, her expression troubled. People are still talking. You know that, right? I know. Virgil told someone you're building a fantasy, that you've lost touch with reality. Nolan poured coffee from the thermos, the steam rising in the cold air. What do you think? I think you're building something real. I think it takes more courage to do this than to play it safe. She paused. But I also think you're running out of time, and I wonder if you've thought about what happens if you don't finish. I'll finish. And if you don't, he met her eyes. Then I lose my daughter. So I'll finish. The certainty in his voice seemed to satisfy her, at least for the moment. She helped him carry lumber for an hour before heading back to town, leaving him with the thermos and the paper bag of pastries he wouldn't eat until dinner. That evening, as the sun dropped below the tree line, Nolan set up his phone on a stump and called Penny. The battery was at 15%, but he'd learned to charge it in his truck during the drive to and from town. Her face appeared on the screen, pixelated and delayed, but smiling. Hi, Daddy. Hey, sweetheart. How was school? Good. We're learning about the water cycle. Did you know clouds are made of tiny water drops? I did know that. You're getting so smart. She beamed at the praise. When can I see your new place? The question came every call now, and every time it hurt a little more. Soon, I'm working on a surprise for you. What kind of surprise? If I told you, it wouldn't be a surprise. She giggled, then her expression turned serious. Mom says you're living in the woods, like camping. Sort of like that. Is it scary, being alone out there? Nolan looked around at the darkening forest, the oak shelter taking shape behind him, the fire he'd built in the pit sending smoke up into the evening air. No, baby, it's not scary. It's actually pretty peaceful. Do you have bears? Haven't seen any bears. Mostly just squirrels and birds. I like squirrels. They talked for 10 more minutes about her day, her friends, a book she was reading in class. When the battery warning flashed at 5%, he told her he loved her and made her promise to be good for her mom. I love you too, Daddy. I can't wait to see the surprise. The screen went dark. Nolan sat in the gathering night, the weight of those words settling over him. He couldn't disappoint her, wouldn't disappoint her. The next morning, he was measuring a board when he heard footsteps approaching. Not Bryn this time. Heavier footsteps, multiple people. 3 teenagers emerged from the trees, 2 boys and a girl, maybe 16 or 17. They stopped at the edge of the clearing, taking in the scene with expressions that ranged from curiosity to mockery. This is it, one of the boys said. This is what everyone's talking about? Looks like a homeless camp, the girl added. The other boy was quieter, actually looking at the work Nolan had done. No, look, he's really building something. That floor is level. Those beams are placed right. It's still a tree, dude. A fallen tree. They argued among themselves for a moment, apparently forgetting Nolan was there. Then the first boy raised his phone, pointing it at the shelter. Don't, Nolan said quietly. It's a free country, man. We can take pictures if we want. You can, but I'm asking you not to. Why? You embarrassed? Nolan set down his measuring tape and straightened to his full height. He wasn't a large man, but 18 years of construction work had given him a solid build, and there was something in his expression that made the teenagers take a step back. I'm not embarrassed, he said evenly. I'm building a home for my daughter, and I'd appreciate it if you respected that. The girl nudged the first boy. Come on, let's go. This is boring anyway. They left, but Nolan heard their laughter echoing through the trees. The quiet boy looked back once, something like understanding in his eyes, before following his friends. Nolan returned to his work, but the encounter had shaken him more than he wanted to admit. It was one thing to know people were talking, another to have them show up and mock him to his face. He thought about what would happen if those pictures ended up online. If Fiona saw them, if the judge saw them when the custody case went to court. Then he looked at the blueprint on his work table, at the careful measurements and precise plans. He looked at the floor he'd built, the beams he'd installed, the vision he was bringing to life board by board. They could mock all they wanted. He would keep building, By the end of the week, he'd framed the first partition wall. It wasn't much, just vertical studs running from floor to ceiling, following the curve of the oak's interior, but it marked a milestone. The shelter was no longer just a cleared space. It was becoming rooms, becoming a home. Nolan stood back and looked at his work, his father's level hanging from his tool belt. 5 weeks left, walls to finish, a fireplace to build, a roof to install over the sections where the oak's trunk didn't provide natural cover. It seemed impossible. But then, everything about this project had seemed impossible from the start. He picked up his hammer and kept working as the sun set and the temperature dropped and the first real cold of winter settled over the forest. The vintage lantern cast dancing shadows across the oak's interior walls, its flame steady behind age-yellowed glass. Nolan had found it in Mr. Pruitt's barn, buried under a pile of tack and horse blankets, its brass fittings tarnished but intact. He'd spent an evening cleaning it, replacing the wick, testing it with kerosene until the flame burned clean and bright. Now it hung from a hand-carved hook near the entrance, the shelter's first real light source. As darkness fell on his 6th week in the forest, Nolan sat on an upturned crate and watched the lantern glow. It was a small thing, but it transformed the space, made it feel less like a construction site and more like a place where someone might actually live. The walls were up now. 3 partition walls, dividing the hollow into distinct areas, each one fitted to follow the oak's natural curve. He'd used every carpentry trick he knew to make them work, cutting angles that would have baffled him as a younger man, learning to read the wood grain and work with it instead of against it. The sleeping area in the back was small, but private, just big enough for a bed frame he planned to build from the last of Mr. Pruitt's salvaged lumber. The central living space had room for a table and 2 chairs, and the kitchen area closest to the entrance was ready for the Riverstone fireplace he would start building tomorrow. His phone buzzed. Bryn's name appeared on the screen. "I'm outside," her text read. "Can I come in?" Nolan stepped out of the oak and found her waiting at the edge of the clearing, a canvas bag slung over her shoulder. She looked nervous, almost shy. "I brought some things," she said. "Fabric for curtains if you want them, and a few other supplies. You didn't have to do that, I know, but I wanted to." He led her inside and her reaction was everything he'd hoped for. She stopped just past the entrance, her hand going to her mouth as she took in the transformation. The walls, the lantern light, the carefully fitted boards that turned a hollow tree into something that resembled a home. "Nolan," she breathed, "this is beautiful." He felt heat rise to his face, unused to genuine praise. "Still needs a lot of work, but look at what you've done. The craftsmanship, the attention to detail." She walked slowly through the space, running her fingers along the walls, testing the floor with her weight. "This isn't a survival shelter. This is art. It's necessity. It's both." She showed him what she'd brought, curtains she'd sewn from heavy canvas, a small propane camping stove to use until he finished the fireplace, packets of dried herbs in glass jars, a thick wool blanket, practical things chosen with care. "The stove is alone," she said, "but the rest is yours." They hung the curtains together, creating a sense of privacy in the sleeping area. The fabric was a deep green that reminded Nolan of the forest itself, and when they finished, Bryn stepped back to admire their work. "Now it really looks like a home," she said. After she left, Nolan sat alone with the lantern and the camping stove and the curtains that made the space feel like it belonged to someone who mattered. He thought about what Bryn had said, that this was art. He'd never thought of his carpentry that way. It had always been just work, just a way to pay bills and support his family. But maybe she was right. Maybe there was something more to it. Something he'd forgotten in all those years of production schedules and contractor deadlines. The next day brought a visitor he hadn't expected. Fiona's car pulled up on the forest road, and she picked her way through the underbrush in shoes that weren't made for hiking. Nolan met her at the clearing's edge, his heart hammering. "I need to see it," she said without preamble. "Whatever you're building, I need to see it." He led her to the oak without speaking. Let the work speak for itself. Fiona stopped at the entrance, taking in the lantern, the walls, the careful construction. She walked inside slowly, examining everything with the critical eye of someone looking for reasons to say no. Nolan stood outside, giving her space, trying not to hope too hard. When she emerged, her expression was complicated. Not quite approval, but not the anger he'd expected either. "You built this," she said. "All of this by yourself?" "Yes." "In 6 weeks?" "Yes." She looked at him, really looked at him, maybe for the first time since the divorce. "You always were good with your hands." "I forgot that. Fiona, I'm not changing my mind about the custody filing. Preston's lawyer is already drawing up the papers." She held up a hand when Nolan started to protest. "But I'll be honest with you. When I drove out here, I expected to find exactly what people have been saying. Some kind of desperate camp, proof that you'd lost your grip on reality. This isn't that. No, it's not. But it's still a tree in the forest, Nolan, and I have to think about what's best for Penny. What's best for Penny is having her father in her life. A father with a real home. Stability, security." Her voice softened slightly. "You have 4 weeks. Finish it, make it somewhere our daughter could actually stay, and maybe we can work something out. But if you don't, I'm going through with this. Do you understand?" "I understand." After she left, Nolan stood in the clearing for a long time, staring at nothing. 4 weeks. The timeline hadn't changed, but hearing it from Fiona made it feel more real, more urgent. He thought about Preston, about the stable life he could offer, about how easy it would be for a judge to look at the paperwork and see a real estate agent with a nice house versus a carpenter living in a tree. He went back inside the oak and picked up his tools. The fireplace wouldn't build itself. He spent the next 3 days gathering river stones from the creek that ran a 1/4 mile from the oak. Each stone had to be the right size, the right shape, flat on at least 2 sides, so they would stack properly. He carried them back to the shelter in a canvas sack, making trip after trip, until his shoulders ached and his hands were raw. Building the fireplace required a different kind of precision than framing walls. Each stone had to be placed just right, fitted together like a 3-dimensional puzzle with mortar filling the gaps. Nolan mixed cement on a plywood board, adding water slowly until the consistency was perfect, then worked methodically from the base up. The structure took shape over days. First the hearth, then the firebox walls, then the beginning of the chimney that would angle up and out through a gap he'd left in the oak's natural canopy. Every stone was tested for stability before he moved on to the next. Every joint was checked and rechecked. On the evening of the 3rd day, Mr. Pruitt appeared at the clearing's edge. He'd brought sandwiches and coffee, and he sat with Nolan while they ate, both men watching the half-finished fireplace in comfortable silence. "Your daddy would have loved to see this," Mr. Pruitt said finally. "You think so?" "I know so. He was always going on about how you had the gift, how you understood wood like it was a living thing." The old farmer took a sip of coffee. "Lost my wife 10 years back, cancer. Afterward, I couldn't figure out what to do with myself. The house was too quiet, too empty. So I worked, rebuilt the barn, repaired every fence on the property, fixed things that didn't need fixing. My kids thought I was avoiding grief, and maybe I was. But the work, it healed something in me, gave me a reason to get up every morning." Nolan understood what he was saying without it being said directly. This shelter wasn't just about custody or proving something to the town. It was about rebuilding himself, about working through the grief of everything he'd lost until he could stand on solid ground again. "Work like this heals a man," Mr. Pruitt continued, "if he lets it." They finished their coffee as the sun set, and after the old farmer left, Nolan returned to the fireplace. He worked by lantern light, placing stones with careful hands, building something that would last. The child's chair sat on the workbench, half-finished, but already recognizable. Nolan had carved it from a single section of oak, cutting away everything that wasn't chair until only the chair remained. The legs were sturdy and thick, the seat wide enough for Penny to sit comfortably, the backrest curved to follow the shape of a small spine. He was working on the details now. Flowers carved into the backrest, her initials on the seat, small flourishes that would make it uniquely hers. 7 weeks into the project, and the shelter was nearly complete. The fireplace stood finished, its river stones mortared tight, its chimney drawing smoke cleanly when he tested it with small fires. The walls were sanded smooth, the floor sealed with a mixture of linseed oil and beeswax that made the salvaged wood glow warm in the lantern light. He'd installed shelves along one wall, built a simple table and bench for the living area, created a kitchen counter from plywood and 2x4s. The oak shelter had become the Oak House, though Nolan hadn't named it yet. That would come later with Penny when she saw it for the first time. He set down his carving knife and examined the chair's backrest. The flowers were taking shape, simple daisies, Penny's favorite. He'd learned to carve from his father, who'd learned from his father, a skill passed down through generations, like the brass level that now hung on the wall. Each petal had to be distinct but harmonious. Each stem had to flow naturally into the next. It was meditative work, the kind that quieted his mind and steadied his hands. A car door slammed somewhere on the forest road. Voices carried through the trees, not harsh but curious. Nolan set down the chair and stepped outside to see a small group of people walking up the path. Not teenagers this time. Adults, maybe 5 or 6 of them, moving cautiously into his clearing. Mr. Reyes, a woman in her 60s, stood at the front, leaning on a walking stick. "I'm Constance. We met briefly at Bryn's diner." He remembered her. The retired teacher with the sharp eyes and the cane. "What can I do for you?" Nolan asked, keeping his voice neutral. "We'd like to see what you've built, if you're willing to show us. There's been so much talk, and I thought it was time to see the truth for ourselves." The others nodded. Nolan recognized a few faces from town. The woman who worked at the post office, a man who ran the gas station, a younger couple he didn't know. They looked more curious than judgmental, but he'd learned not to trust first impressions. "All right," he said finally, "but shoes off at the door." They followed him to the oak, and as each person stepped inside, their expressions shifted from skepticism to genuine surprise. Nolan watched them take in the space, the carved walls, the stone fireplace, the furniture he'd built, the lantern light reflecting off polished wood. They moved through it carefully, respectfully, examining his craftsmanship with the attention to detail that only comes from people who understand what good work looks like. "This is remarkable," Constance said, running her hand along one of the partition walls. "The way you've worked with the tree's natural shape, instead of fighting against it. And these joints," she examined where 2 boards met at a curved angle. "This is master-level carpentry. Thank you. Your father taught you this?" "Some of it. The rest I learned on the job." She nodded slowly, then looked at him with those sharp eyes. "I taught your father, you know. 6th grade. He was one of the brightest students I ever had, and one of the hardest working. Always had sawdust under his fingernails, even as a boy." She paused. "He'd be proud of you, not because you're building a house, because you're not giving up." The words hit harder than Nolan expected. He managed a nod, not trusting his voice. The group stayed for 20 minutes, asking questions about his process, admiring details he'd thought no one would notice. When they finally left, Constance was the last to go. She pressed a folded piece of paper into his hand. "That's my phone number. If you need anything, supplies, help, someone to talk to, you call me. Understand?" "Yes, ma'am." After they left, Nolan unfolded the paper. Below her number she'd written, "The town is watching. Show them what perseverance looks like." That evening he returned to carving the chair. He'd almost finished the flowers when his phone rang. Not Fiona this time, a number he didn't recognize. He almost didn't answer, but something made him pick up. "Is this Nolan Reyes?" A man's voice, professional but not unfriendly. "Speaking. My name is Kirby Shaw. I'm a freelance journalist. I've been hearing about your project, and I'd like to write an article about it." Nolan's first instinct was to refuse. The last thing he needed was more attention, more people showing up to gawk or judge. But Kirby kept talking. "I'm not interested in making you look foolish," he said. I think what you're doing is newsworthy for the right reasons. A man rebuilding his life, literally and figuratively. That's a story people need to hear. Just think about it. You don't have to decide now. But I've seen some of the things people are saying about you online. Wouldn't you rather have your actual story out there instead of the gossip? Nolan looked around the shelter, at everything he'd built, at the chair he was carving for his daughter. Not yet, he said. Maybe when it's finished. Fair enough. I'll call back in a couple weeks. After he hung up, Nolan sat with the chair in his lap, thinking about stories and truth and what people saw when they looked at his life from the outside. They saw failure, lost job, lost home, man living in the woods. But from the inside it felt different. It felt like he was building something that mattered more than any paycheck or lease ever had. The next morning brought a surprise visitor. His brother Garrett appeared at the clearing, carrying a toolbox and looking uncomfortable. "Thought you might need some help," Garrett said without preamble. "You came to help me build?" "I came to see what you're doing. And maybe if you need an extra pair of hands to help." Nolan studied his brother, looking for mockery or pity, finding neither. Just awkward sincerity and maybe the beginning of respect. "I could use help with the roof panels," Nolan admitted. "Some of the oak's natural canopy isn't enough. I need to install proper covering in a few places." They worked together for the first time since they were boys, measuring and cutting and fitting panels that would keep rain and snow from reaching the interior. Garrett was methodical and careful, asking questions about Nolan's design choices, offering suggestions based on his own different kind of precision. During a water break, Garrett finally said what he'd come to say. "I was wrong about you. About this. I thought you were running away, but you're running toward something. There's a difference. Took me a while to figure that out, too." "Dad would be proud," Garrett said quietly. "I know Constance already told you that, but I wanted you to hear it from family, too." They finished the roof work by afternoon, and as Garrett was leaving, he turned back one more time. "The custody hearing is in 3 weeks. You going to be ready?" "I have to be." "Then you will be." After his brother left, Nolan returned to the chair. He carved Penny's initials into the seat, PMR, for Penny Marie Reyes, and added a final daisy to the backrest. Then he carried it inside and placed it at the table, a perfect size for a child who would soon sit there eating breakfast, reading books, living life in the home her father had built from nothing. 3 weeks. The shelter was nearly done, but nearly wasn't good enough. He picked up his tools and kept working as the sun crossed the sky and the temperature dropped and winter crept closer through the forest. The photograph was in a simple frame, glass slightly clouded with age. Nolan's father stood in front of a house he'd built 30 years ago, hammer in hand, a satisfied smile on his weathered face. It had been taken on completion day, the moment when a construction project transforms into someone's home. Nolan remembered that day. He'd been 16, helping his father with the final cleanup, learning what it meant to finish something right. Now the photograph sat on the stone mantel of the fireplace, looking down on the shelter with what Nolan imagined was approval. He'd found it among his mother's things at Garrett's house, asked to keep it, and his brother had agreed without argument. Some things were too important to quibble over. 8 weeks. The oak house was functionally complete. Every wall was finished, every surface sanded and sealed. The fireplace drew perfectly, filling the space with warmth when he lit it in the evenings. The kitchen area had a counter, shelves for dishes, hooks for pots and pans. The sleeping area had a bed frame with a mattress he'd bought from a second-hand store in town, using money from odd jobs he'd picked up. The living space had the table, the bench, and Penny's chair waiting. He'd added final touches over the past week. Curtains Bryn had sewn, hanging in the windows he'd cut into the oak sides. Herb pots by the entrance growing rosemary and thyme from cuttings Constance had given him. A small bookshelf holding the few books he owned. The space no longer looked like a construction project. It looked like a home. Today was the day, Penny's 9th birthday. Fiona had agreed to bring her for a visit. 1 hour, supervised, to see what Nolan had built. It wasn't the overnight stay he'd hoped for, but it was a start. It was everything. He spent the morning in final preparations. Swept the floor again, though it didn't need it. Arranged the furniture, though it was already arranged. Built a small fire in the fireplace to take the chill off. Made sure Penny's chair was positioned just right at the table, visible the moment she walked in. When he heard voices on the path, his heart started hammering. He stepped outside to meet them. Fiona emerged from the trees first, her expression guarded but not hostile. And behind her, almost dancing with excitement, came Penny. "Daddy!" She ran to him, and he caught her in a hug that lifted her off the ground. "Happy birthday, sweetheart. Where's the surprise?" "Mom said you have a surprise." "Close your eyes," Nolan said, taking her hand. No peeking. He led her to the entrance of the oak, Fiona following silently behind. At the threshold he paused. "Okay, open them." Penny's eyes flew open, and her gasp of pure wonder made every hour of work, every aching muscle, every moment of doubt completely worth it. "Dad, you built this? You actually built this?" "For you," he said quietly. "For us." She stepped inside slowly, turning in circles to take it all in. The curved walls following the tree's natural shape. The fireplace with its river stones, the lantern light casting warm shadows. And there, at the table, her special chair with her initials and the carved daisies. "That's mine?" Her voice was barely a whisper. "All yours. Your own chair in your own home." Penny ran to it, climbed into the seat, tested its sturdiness with little bounces. Perfect fit. She traced the carved flowers with her fingers, found her initials, looked up at Nolan with tears in her eyes. "It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen." Fiona stood near the entrance, and when Nolan glanced at her, he saw her own eyes were wet. She walked through the space slowly, examining everything with a different expression than her first visit. Not looking for flaws now, just looking. They spent the afternoon together. Nolan showed Penny every detail, how the fireplace worked, where he'd built a reading nook into the oak's natural curve, how the curtains could be pulled for privacy. She explored with the unself-conscious joy of a child discovering magic is real. "Can I live here with you?" Penny asked, sitting in her chair with her feet swinging. "Please?" Nolan felt his throat tighten. "That's what I'm working towards, sweetheart." "When?" "Soon." Fiona checked her watch. "We need to go soon, Penny. Say goodbye to your dad." "But I just got here." "I know, baby, but we talked about this." 1 hour. Penny's face fell, but she nodded with the resignation of a child who's learned that arguing doesn't change adult decisions. She hugged Nolan fiercely. "I love you, Daddy. I love the Oak House. I love you too." More than anything. As they were leaving, Fiona lingered at the entrance. She looked at Nolan, and something in her expression had shifted. "You really did it," she said quietly. "I told you I would. I didn't believe you. I thought—" She stopped, choosing her words carefully. "Preston is stable. He has a nice house in town, a good job, everything I thought was important. But he's not you. Fiona, I'm not saying we're getting back together. That ship sailed years ago. But Penny needs her father. She needs this." She gestured at the oak shelter. "What you've shown her here, about not giving up, about building something from nothing that's worth more than stability. Does this mean I'm dropping the custody challenge?" "We'll work out a proper visitation schedule. Weekends here if you want them. Holidays shared." She paused. "Preston isn't happy about it, but this isn't his decision to make." Nolan felt something break open in his chest. Relief so profound it almost hurt. "Thank you." "Don't thank me. You earned this." She looked around the shelter one more time. "I just hope you understand what you've taken on. Living out here full-time, especially in winter, I'll manage. I know you will. You always do eventually." After they left, Nolan sat alone in the oak house. The fire crackled in the fireplace. His father's photograph looked down from the mantel. Penny's chair sat empty at the table, waiting for next weekend when she'd return. He pulled out his phone and called the number Kirby had given him. "Still interested in that interview?" Nolan asked, when the journalist answered. "Absolutely." "When?" "Tomorrow. Come see what I've built." That evening, as the sun set and temperature dropped, Nolan lit a full fire in the fireplace for the first time. The flames caught quickly, the smoke drawing up through the chimney exactly as designed. Heat radiated out into the space, warming the walls, chasing away the November chill. He sat by the fire with a cup of coffee, watching shadows dance on the carved walls, and let himself feel something he hadn't allowed in months. Pride, not arrogance or ego, just simple satisfaction in work done right. He'd set out to build a shelter and ended up building something more. A home, a future, proof that the things people dismissed as impossible could become real if you refused to stop working. His phone buzzed. A text from Constance. Heard Penny visited. Heard it went well. Proud of you. Then Bryn. Tomorrow's special at the diner is Oak House breakfast. Come by if you can. Then Mr. Pruitt. Your daddy would have been proud, son. Then Garrett. Mom would have loved it. Good work, little brother. Nolan read each message, feeling the weight of community he'd thought he'd lost. These people had watched him struggle, had offered help in their own ways, had believed in him even when he wasn't sure he believed in himself. He added a log to the fire and pulled out the journal Constance had given him weeks ago. He'd been too busy building to write much, but tonight felt like the right time to start. Day 1, he wrote. Not of building the shelter, of understanding why I built it. He paused, thinking about everything that had brought him to this moment. The job loss, the eviction, the return to Millfield Creek with nothing but a truck and a dream, the mockery and the doubt and the grinding daily work. Penny's face when she saw her chair. Fiona's changed expression. The photograph on the mantel. I thought I was building walls and a roof, he continued. But I was building myself back up, one board at a time. The Oak House isn't just where I live. It's proof that broken things can become beautiful if you're willing to do the work. He closed the journal and set it on the mantel next to his father's photograph. Outside, the first real winter storm was moving in. Weather Service had warned about it all week. But inside the Oak House, the fire burned warm and steady. Nolan was ready. For the storm, for winter, for whatever came next. He'd built something that would last. The storm hit on the second night with a fury that surprised even the Weather Service. What was supposed to be a moderate snowfall turned into a full blizzard, wind screaming through the forest, temperature plummeting to single digits. Nolan sat by the fire in the Oak House, listening to the wind howl outside, feeling the walls hold steady against the assault. The shelter performed exactly as designed. The oak's bulk blocked the worst of the wind. The walls he'd built kept the cold at bay. The fireplace drew perfectly, filling the space with heat. He'd stocked firewood for weeks in anticipation of this moment, and now he fed the flames steadily, keeping the temperature comfortable. By the second day, the snow was 3 feet deep and still falling. The path to the forest road had disappeared completely. Nolan couldn't have left if he'd wanted to, but he didn't want to. This was the test he'd been waiting for, proof that the Oak House could weather the worst winter could throw at it. On the third night he heard something over the wind, voices, faint but desperate. Nolan grabbed his flashlight and stepped outside into the storm. The cold hit like a physical blow, snow driving sideways, visibility near zero. He swept the flashlight beam across the clearing and caught movement at the tree line. 3 figures stumbled into the light. A man supporting an injured leg, a woman barely able to walk, and a teenage boy between them trying to hold everyone up. They were soaked through, shaking violently, eyes wide with fear and cold. "Help," the man managed through chattering teeth. "Please, inside, now." Nolan didn't ask questions, just grabbed the woman's arm and helped them toward the oak. The boy, 16, maybe 17, was supporting most of his father's weight. All 3 were on the edge of hypothermia. He got them through the entrance and immediately into action. Stripped their wet clothes, wrapped them in every blanket he had, positioned them by the fire. The woman, Iris, she said when she could speak, was in the worst shape, her lips blue, her hands white and numb. Nolan made hot tea with shaking hands, forcing them to drink it slowly. "Car," the man, Glenn, managed between sips, slid off the road. Half-mile back. Tried to walk. Got lost. How long were you out there? Hours, 3, maybe 4. Lost track. 3 hours in this storm. They were lucky to be alive. Nolan tended to Glenn's ankle, badly twisted, maybe broken, but it could wait until the storm passed. He made more tea, heated up soup on his camping stove, kept the fire burning hot. Slowly, color returned to their faces. The violent shaking subsided to occasional tremors. The boy, Jasper, looked around the shelter with undisguised amazement. "You live here? In a tree?" "It's an oak," Nolan said, stirring the soup. "And yes, but this is incredible. How did you build all this?" "One board at a time." As they warmed and the immediate danger passed, their story came out. Glenn and Iris were from 2 towns over, traveling to see Iris's dying mother in hospice. They'd taken back roads to avoid highway traffic, confident they could beat the storm. But the snow had come faster than predicted, and their old sedan, the good car had been sold months ago to pay medical bills, had slid on black ice and ended up in a ditch. "GPS went out," Glenn said, holding his teacup like it was precious. "Phones died. We tried to follow the road, but lost it in the snow. Saw smoke from your chimney. Thought we were hallucinating at first." Iris started crying quietly. Relief, shock, gratitude all mixed together. "We would have died out there. Our son—" She couldn't finish. "You're safe now," Nolan said. "Storm should pass by morning." "We'll get you help then." Glenn looked at him with an expression Nolan couldn't quite read. "You're the Oak Hermit, the one people have been talking about. That's what they call me. They say you're crazy. Living out here like this?" Nolan stirred the soup, not bothering to defend himself. Glenn continued. "They're wrong. You just saved 3 lives with your crazy treehouse." The word hung in the air for a moment. Then Glenn laughed, a slightly hysterical sound that held exhaustion and relief and the surreal absurdity of their situation. "Sorry, I don't mean, this place is amazing. I work in finance, or I did before the layoffs. Spent my whole career in climate-controlled offices. Couldn't build a birdhouse if my life depended on it. But you," he gestured at the shelter, "you made this from a dead tree." "Fallen tree," Nolan corrected. "Not dead, just down." As the storm continued to rage outside, they shared stories. Glenn admitted he'd lost his job 6 months ago, had been scrambling to find work while Iris's mother got sicker and medical bills piled up. They'd sold their good car, downsized their apartment, cut every corner they could. The trip to hospice was in the old sedan because it was all they had left. "I know what people think," Glenn said quietly. "That we're failures. That we should have saved more, planned better, been more responsible. But life doesn't care about your plans." Nolan handed him a bowl of soup. "No, it doesn't." Iris had been quiet, wrapped in blankets and staring at the fire. Now she spoke. "When we were out there lost in the snow, I thought about all the things that don't matter. The house we used to have, the cars, the furniture, none of it meant anything. Just wanted to see my mother one more time. Just wanted my son to be safe." She looked at Nolan with tears on her cheeks. "Thank you. Not just for the shelter. For showing up. For being here. Anyone would have done the same, would they? Or would they have told us to go away, that they didn't want the trouble?" Nolan thought about the town, about the mockery and judgment he'd faced. But Virgil refusing credit and teenagers taking pictures and people calling him crazy. "I don't know," he admitted. Jasper had been exploring the shelter with teenage curiosity, examining the walls, the furniture, the fireplace. Now he came back to the fire. How long did this take you to build?" he asked. 8 weeks. Still working on it, really. Always something to improve. 8 weeks. Jasper shook his head. "At school, they're always asking what we want to do with our lives. I never had a good answer. But this, building something real, something that matters, maybe that's worth doing." His parents exchanged a look. Glenn reached for the backpack they'd brought, pulled out a wallet, found a family photo. 3 people in happier times, standing in front of a house they probably didn't own anymore, smiling like the future was certain. "We took this 2 years ago," Glenn said, showing it to Nolan, "before everything fell apart. I look at it and barely recognize us. But you know what? We're still here. Still fighting. Maybe that's enough." Nolan understood what he was saying without it being said directly. They were people the world had chewed up and spit out, just like him. Different circumstances, same struggle. And in this moment, sheltered from the storm in a home built from a fallen tree, they were survivors. The storm finally broke near dawn. Nolan helped Glenn outside, supporting his injured ankle, and they saw the world transformed. 3 feet of fresh snow blanketed everything, the forest silent and pristine under clearing skies. And in the distance, they could hear engines, rescue vehicles on the forest road. Glenn turned to Nolan before they left. "I don't know how to thank you properly. You saved our lives with something people mock. That says more about them than it does about you." "Just take care of your family," Nolan said. "That's thanks enough." He watched them make their way toward the sounds of rescue, Jasper supporting his father, Iris walking steadily now that warmth and rest had restored her. They looked back once, waving, and then they were gone into the white landscape. Nolan returned to the oak house. The fire had burned low, but the shelter was still warm, still solid, still standing after the storm had thrown everything it had against it. He'd set out to build a home for himself and his daughter. But in 3 desperate hours during a blizzard, the oak house had become something more. It had become salvation. The news vans arrived by mid-morning, their satellite dishes incongruous against the snow-covered forest. Nolan stood at the entrance of the oak house, exhausted from a sleepless night, and watched reporters set up cameras on the forest road. Someone had called them, probably the rescue crew, or maybe Glenn and Iris themselves, wanting to tell their story while it was still fresh. Kirby was among them, but he hung back from the others, respecting the interview agreement they'd made. The rest descended like locusts, shouting questions, asking for statements, trying to get shots of the shelter through the trees. A woman in a red coat pushed forward, microphone extended. "Mr. Reyes, can you tell us about the rescue? How did you find the stranded family?" "They found me," Nolan said. "Saw the smoke from my chimney. And you took them in. Strangers in the middle of a blizzard?" "Of course I did. What else would I do?" The question seemed to stump her. Behind her, other reporters were filming the oak, getting footage of the shelter that people had been mocking for 2 months. The footage would be different from what they expected. Not a desperate camp, but a crafted home. Glenn appeared with the rescue crew, his ankle wrapped but able to walk with a crutch. Iris and Jasper were with him, and when they saw the reporters, they didn't hesitate. They told the story straight. The storm, the lost car, the desperate wandering through the snow, the smoke that saved them, the shelter that kept them alive. "This man saved our lives," Glenn said into the cameras. "While people were calling him crazy, he was building something that mattered. Something real." Iris was more emotional. "We would have died out there. Our son, our family, gone. But this shelter, this home that everyone mocked, it was a miracle." Jasper turned to look at the oak house, his teenage earnestness cutting through the media circus. "He built this in 8 weeks, from a fallen tree, with his own hands. That's not crazy. That's incredible." The footage went viral within hours. Local news picked it up, then regional, then national. Social media exploded with shares and comments. The narrative flipped completely, from mockery to admiration. From oak hermit losing his mind to hero builder saves family with mocked shelter. Nolan's phone, charged in his truck, started buzzing incessantly. Messages, calls, emails. He ignored most of them, but some couldn't be ignored. Fiona called first. "I saw the news. Nolan, are you all right?" "I'm fine. Tired, but fine. That family, they're saying you saved their lives. The shelter saved their lives. I just happened to be here. Don't do that. Don't diminish what you did." Her voice was thick with emotion. "Penny saw the news too. She's telling everyone at school that her daddy is a hero." Nolan felt his throat tighten. "I'm not a hero. I'm just a father trying to build a home." "You're both," Fiona said quietly. "The custody hearing is in 2 days. I'm not going. I already withdrew the filing this morning, made it official. Preston isn't happy, but he'll get over it. Penny needs you. And after seeing what you've built, what you've done, I know she's safe with you." After he hung up, Nolan sat on Penny's chair, feeling the weight of the past 8 weeks settle over him. He'd started this project desperate and alone, mocked by a town that saw only his failures. Now that same town was calling him a hero, and the shelter he'd built in defiance of their judgment had proven itself in the most dramatic way possible. Bryn arrived in the afternoon with food from the diner, tears streaming down her face. She hugged him without words, then pulled back to look at him. "I always believed in you," she said. But this, Nolan, the whole town is talking. They're ashamed of how they treated you. Virgil can barely look anyone in the eye. He doesn't need to be ashamed. He was protecting his business. He was being cruel. We all were in our own ways. But you showed us what real strength looks like. Mr. Pruitt came next, bringing his wife, a quiet woman Nolan had never met. They stood in the shelter, examining the walls built from lumber salvaged from their collapsed barn, and Mr. Pruitt's weathered face showed something like pride. "Told you to build it right," he said gruffly. "You did more than that. You built it perfect." Constance arrived with fresh supplies, blankets, food, a new lantern. She hugged him the way a grandmother hugs a grandson, fierce and protective. "Your father is smiling down," she said. "I taught him and I taught you when you were young. I always knew you had something special. Glad the rest of the town finally sees it too." Even Garrett came, bringing his wife and kids. They toured the Oak House with genuine amazement, and Garrett's children asked 100 questions about how their uncle had built everything. Garrett pulled Nolan aside afterward. "I was wrong about you. About this whole thing, and I'm sorry I wasn't there when you needed support." He paused, struggling with words. "Dad would have been here every day, helping you build. I should have been too. You're here now," Nolan said. "That's what matters." That evening, as the sun set and the reporters finally dispersed, Kirby stayed behind for the promised interview. They sat by the fire in the Oak House, and Kirby asked thoughtful questions about the build, the process, the meaning behind it all. "What do you want people to know?" Kirby asked finally. "After everything, what's the message?" Nolan thought about it, choosing his words carefully. "That you're never too broken to rebuild. That what looks like an ending can be a beginning. That the things people mock might be the things that save them." Kirby wrote it down, then set aside his notebook. "For what it's worth, I think you did something extraordinary here. Not just building the shelter, refusing to quit when everyone said you were crazy. That takes a kind of courage most people don't have." After Kirby left, Nolan sat alone with the fire and the silence. Tomorrow, Glenn and Iris would return with Jasper, bringing gifts and gratitude. The day after that, Penny would come for her first weekend stay. The custody battle was over, won not in a courtroom, but through 8 weeks of stubborn determination and skilled hands. He opened the journal Constance had given him and wrote a new entry. "They're calling me a hero, but I don't feel like one. I feel like a man who was drowning and found a piece of wood to cling to. That wood happened to be a fallen oak, and I had the skills to shape it into something that could save not just me, but others too. Maybe that's what heroism actually is, using what you have to help whoever needs it, without expecting anything in return." He closed the journal and added another log to the fire. Outside, the snow lay pristine and undisturbed, the forest peaceful under stars that were finally visible again. The storm had passed, literally and figuratively, and in its wake had left validation he'd never sought but couldn't help appreciating. His phone buzzed one more time. A text from a number he didn't recognize. "This is Glenn. Wanted you to have my contact info. Can't thank you enough for what you did. Jasper won't stop talking about learning carpentry. If you're ever willing to teach him, we'd be honored." Nolan typed back, "He can visit any time. Plenty of work to do here." The response came immediately. "He'll be there Saturday. Fair warning, he'll probably never want to leave." Nolan smiled, thinking about passing on the skills his father had taught him, the way knowledge moved through generations like a river finding its course. The Oak House wasn't just shelter anymore. It was becoming a place where broken things, people, dreams, futures, could be rebuilt into something stronger. He stoked the fire one last time and prepared for bed. Tomorrow would bring more attention, more visitors, more questions. But tonight, he could rest knowing he'd done what he set out to do. He'd built a home, and in the process, he'd rebuilt himself. Friday afternoon arrived with clear skies and temperatures that hinted at winter's mercy. Nolan spent the morning preparing the Oak House for Penny's arrival, her first real overnight stay, not just a supervised visit, but an actual weekend with her father in their shared home. He'd cleaned everything twice, built up a good supply of firewood, stocked the kitchen area with her favorite foods. The child's chair sat waiting at the table, and in the sleeping area, He'd set up a small cot beside his bed frame, complete with blankets decorated with stars that he'd bought in town, with money from the odd jobs that kept coming now that people knew what he could build. Fiona's car appeared on the forest road just after 3. Nolan walked out to meet them, his heart doing something complicated in his chest, nervousness and joy and gratitude all tangled together. Penny burst from the car before it fully stopped, running to him with her backpack bouncing. She'd grown in the weeks since her birthday visit, or maybe she just seemed bigger now that she was really his again, really part of his life in a way the divorce had tried to prevent. "Daddy, I'm here for the whole weekend." "I know, sweetheart. I've been counting the hours." Fiona retrieved a bag from the trunk, Penny's clothes, her books, her stuffed animals. She handed it to Nolan, and their fingers touched briefly. "She's been talking about nothing else all week," Fiona said. "Fair warning. She's told everyone at school about the Oak House. Her teacher wants to do a project about it. That's fine with me. Preston and I broke up," Fiona said suddenly, not quite meeting his eyes. "It wasn't working. He wanted—" She stopped, shook her head. "Doesn't matter. I just thought you should know. I'm sorry. Don't be." He was steady, but steady isn't the same as right. She looked at the Oak House visible through the trees. "You built something impossible, Nolan. Not everyone can live with that kind of determination. Makes the rest of us feel small. That wasn't my intention. I know. That's what makes it worse." She smiled, but there was sadness in it. "Take care of our girl. I'll pick her up Sunday evening." After Fiona left, Penny took Nolan's hand and pulled him toward the shelter. "Can we work on the sign now? You promised we could make a sign together." He'd promised exactly that. The hand-carved sign reading "The Oak House" was waiting on his workbench, the letters outlined but not yet carved deep. Nolan had saved this project specifically for Penny, knowing she'd want to be part of naming their home. They worked together in the afternoon light, Nolan guiding her small hands as she held the carving knife, showing her how to follow the grain, how to cut with control instead of force. Each letter took time and patience, and Penny's tongue stuck out slightly as she concentrated, the same expression Nolan's father used to get when working on detailed projects. "This is hard," Penny said after finishing the O. "The best things usually are. Is that why you built the Oak House? Because it was hard?" Nolan thought about how to answer that. "I built it because I needed to. Because giving up would have been easier, but easier isn't always better. Mom says you're brave. Your mom is generous." "No, really. She told me that you did something she couldn't do. That you made something from nothing when everyone said it was impossible." Penny looked up at him with eyes that held too much understanding for a 9-year-old. "Is that what brave means? Doing impossible things? Sometimes. Sometimes brave just means doing the next right thing, even when you're scared." They finished carving the sign as the sun dropped toward the tree line. Penny insisted on adding both their initials at the bottom, NR and PR, making it official that the Oak House belonged to both of them. Then they installed it above the entrance, using hooks Nolan had fashioned from oak branches, and they stepped back together to admire their work. "The Oak House," Penny read aloud, running her finger under each word. "With my dad. This is where I live sometimes now, right?" "Right, weekends and holidays and any other time you want to visit. I want to visit all the time." That evening, they cooked dinner together on the small stove. Nothing fancy, just pasta and sauce, but Penny treated it like a grand adventure. She set the table carefully, placing forks and napkins just so, making sure her chair was positioned perfectly. When they sat down to eat, she looked around the shelter with satisfaction. "This is better than a regular house," she announced. "Yeah? Why's that?" "Because you made it, and because it's magic." "Magic? It's a tree that's also a house. That's definitely magic." After dinner, Nolan lit the fire, and they settled into the evening routine he'd been dreaming about for months. Penny pulled out a book from her backpack, one about a girl who lived in a treehouse and had adventures, and Nolan read to her by firelight, his voice mixing with the crackle of burning wood and the soft whisper of wind through the forest. When he reached the end of a chapter, Penny was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, can you tell me about when you were little? About Grandpa?" So Nolan told her about his father, about learning to build, about the barn roof they'd repaired together, about the brass level that now hung on the wall. He told her about his father's hands, always moving, always creating, always teaching. And he told her about the photograph on the mantel, about the house his father had built, and the pride that came from finishing something right. "Grandpa would have loved the oak house," Penny said sleepily. "I think he would have. And he would have loved me, right? Even though he died before I was born? He would have loved you more than anything. Just like I do." She nestled deeper into the blankets, her eyes growing heavy. "Dad, I'm proud of you." The words landed with unexpected weight. Nolan had been chasing approval for months. From the town, from Fiona, from the judge, who never had to make a custody decision. But hearing it from his daughter, from the person whose opinion mattered most, made everything else fade into insignificance. "I'm proud of you too, sweetheart. Even though I'm just a kid, I haven't built anything. You're 9 years old, and you faced your parents' divorce and your dad losing everything, and you never stopped believing in me. That takes more strength than building any shelter. You're the bravest person I know." Penny smiled, already half asleep. "We're both brave then. The brave family in the oak house." After she drifted off completely, Nolan sat by the fire and watched her sleep. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked under her arm, her face peaceful in the firelight. This was what he'd been building toward. Not just walls and a roof, but moments like this. His daughter, safe and warm and happy, in a home they'd created together. He thought about the path that had led here. The job loss that had seemed like the end of everything. The eviction. The mockery, the desperate plan to build shelter in the forest. Every setback, every moment of doubt, every nail driven into salvaged wood had been leading to this moment. Nolan added another log to the fire and opened his journal. He wrote about Penny's arrival, about carving the sign together, about her falling asleep to stories by the fire, and he wrote about understanding finally what he'd actually built. The Oak House was never about proving something to the town or winning a custody battle, he wrote. It was about creating a place where my daughter could see that falling doesn't mean staying down, that broken things can become beautiful, that a father's love can be measured in straight cuts and level floors and hours spent building impossible dreams. He closed the journal and looked at his daughter sleeping peacefully in the home he'd made. Outside, the forest was quiet under stars and moonlight. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. Tomorrow, they'd explore the woods together. They'd carve more projects. They'd cook meals and tell stories and live the life he'd fought so hard to build. But tonight, this was enough. This was everything. Morning light filtered through the gaps in the oak house, painting stripes of gold across the wooden floor. Nolan woke to the sound of Penny humming softly, already awake, and drawing in a notebook she'd brought. She looked up when she heard him stir. "I'm making a map of the oak house," she announced, "so I can show my friends exactly how it looks." They made breakfast together, scrambled eggs and toast on the small stove, orange juice from the cooler Nolan kept stocked. Penny insisted on doing the dishes afterward, standing on a crate to reach the basin, taking the task seriously in the way children do when given real responsibility. Mid-morning brought visitors. Bryn arrived first with fresh pastries and juice boxes specifically for Penny. She knelt to the girl's level. "Your dad talks about you all the time," Bryn said. "Says you're the reason he built all this." Penny beamed. "He built it for both of us." Mr. Pruitt came next with his wife, bringing carved wooden animals he'd made in his workshop, a deer, a bear, a fox. Gifts for Penny that she accepted with wide-eyed delight, lining them up on the shelf like precious treasures. Then Constance arrived with something unexpected, a leather-bound journal, blank pages waiting to be filled. "This is for you," she told Nolan, pressing it into his hands. "Your story deserves to be remembered. Write it down, not for fame, but to help others who've lost their way." Nolan accepted the journal, understanding its significance. "I don't know what to say. Say you'll use it. Say you'll document this journey so the next person who falls can see how you got back up." "I will. I promise." The gathering grew naturally as the morning progressed. Glenn and Iris arrived with Jasper, bringing quality lumber and supplies they'd purchased as thanks. "We want to help you expand," Glenn said. "Build a workshop maybe if you're willing. And Jasper, he hasn't stopped talking about learning carpentry. If you'll teach him, we'd be grateful. Jasper's eagerness was palpable. Please, I want to learn to build things that matter. Nolan looked at the teenager, 16 years old and hungry for purpose, the same age Nolan had been when his father started teaching him seriously. You can come every Saturday. We'll start with basics and work up from there. Penny and Jasper bonded immediately, exploring the forest together while the adults talked about plans for expansion. Nolan showed Glenn and Iris the areas where he could build a small workshop, explained his vision for creating a space where he could take on carpentry projects, earn steady income while staying close to the Oak House. You could teach classes, Iris suggested. I saw online that people are interested in what you've done. They want to learn from you. I'm not a teacher. Neither was your father, probably. But he taught you, and now you can teach others. More townspeople arrived through the afternoon. Virgil with his wife, both apologetic and genuinely impressed by what they saw. Virgil pulled Nolan aside, discomfort clear on his weathered face. I was wrong about you. Wrong to refuse credit, wrong to spread doubt. If you need supplies now, for the workshop or anything else, we'll work something out. Fair terms. I appreciate that. You earned it. Earned more than an apology too. But it's all I've got to give. Even Garrett arrived with his family, and the brothers stood side by side looking at the Oak House while their children played with Penny. Dad would be proud, Garrett said quietly, echoing words he'd said before, but with deeper meaning now. Not just of the building, of who you've become. I'm still figuring out who that is. Aren't we all? Garrett smiled. But you're doing it honestly. That's more than most people manage. As the sun moved toward evening, Kirby returned for a follow-up interview. But this time, he was interested in more than just Nolan's story. What do you want people to know? Kirby asked, recorder running. After everything that's happened, the mockery, the rescue, the transformation, what's the real message? Nolan thought about it, looking around at the gathering of people who'd shown up to support him, at Penny playing with the other children, at the Oak House standing solid and warm. That you're never too broken to rebuild, he said carefully. That what looks like an ending can be a beginning. That the things people mock might be the things that save them. And that the measure of a man isn't in what he loses, but in what he builds with what remains. Kirby wrote it down, then smiled. That's going to make a hell of a headline. As visitors began leaving with promises to return, with hugs and handshakes and genuine warmth, Fiona arrived to pick up Penny, but she lingered, watching the scene with an expression Nolan couldn't quite read. This is good, she said finally, pulling him aside while Penny said goodbye to her new friends. Really good. You've built more than a shelter, Nolan. You've built a community. They built it as much as I did. No, you gave them something to believe in. That matters more than you know. She paused, choosing her words carefully. I want to make the custody arrangement official. Equal time, proper schedule. Penny thrives here. She needs this, needs you as much as she needs stability in town. Thank you. Don't thank me. You earned it. She looked at the Oak House one more time. I spent years thinking success meant the right house, the right job, the right appearance. But you lost everything and built something that actually matters. I'm still learning what that means. After everyone left, as the sun set and evening settled over the forest, Nolan and Penny sat together by the fire. She was tired from the busy day, content and peaceful in her special chair. Dad, when I grow up, can I build houses too? You can build anything you want, sweetheart. Good, because I want to build places where people can be safe, like you did. Nolan pulled her close, feeling the weight and the gift of her words. Then that's exactly what you'll do. They sat together as the fire burned and the stars emerged, and the Oak House held them safe in its wooden embrace. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new projects, new opportunities. But tonight was perfect exactly as it was. A father and daughter in a home built from determination and love, surrounded by a community that had learned to see strength in falling and rising again. 3 months had passed since the storm that changed everything. Winter had settled fully over Millfield Creek, but the Oak House stood warm and solid against the cold, smoke rising steadily from the stone chimney that had proven itself 100 times over. Nolan stood at the Forest Road entrance, watching workers install the bronze plaque the town council had commissioned. It read, "The Oak House, where one man's determination became a community's inspiration." He'd tried to refuse it, but Constance had insisted, and when Constance insisted, even stubborn carpenters knew better than to argue. The small ceremony had been simple. A few words from the mayor, some applause from townspeople who'd gathered, and then everyone had dispersed, leaving Nolan alone with the plaque and his thoughts. He touched the bronze surface, still cold from the morning air, and felt the weight of what it represented. Not his achievement alone, but the community's transformation, their willingness to see past their own judgment and recognize something true. Life had found a rhythm now. Penny came every weekend, her routines firmly established. She'd claimed the reading nook as her special space, filled it with books and drawings and the wooden animals Mr. Pruitt kept carving for her. During the week, Nolan worked on carpentry commissions that had started coming in steadily. Custom furniture, repairs, small construction projects. The workshop beside the Oak House was taking shape with Glenn and Jasper's help, a space where Nolan could work and eventually teach. Jasper arrived every Saturday morning, eager and focused, learning to read wood grain and measure twice and cut once. The boy had a natural talent that reminded Nolan of himself at that age, and watching him develop skills felt like passing on something precious, the way his father had passed it to him. Fiona had found her own path. She'd taken a new job, moved to a smaller apartment she could actually afford, stopped trying to be something she wasn't. They'd established a respectful friendship built on their shared love for Penny, co-parenting with honesty instead of resentment. She visited the Oak House sometimes, having coffee with Nolan while Penny played, and they talked like two people who'd survived a war together and come out changed but intact. Glenn and Iris had become regular visitors, bringing meals and company and gratitude that never quite faded. Glenn had found new work, and Iris's mother had passed peacefully with family around her. They credited the Oak House with giving them perspective, showing them that material losses didn't define worth, that surviving mattered more than appearing successful. The town itself had changed. Virgil now supplied materials at fair prices, sometimes throwing in extras without being asked. Bryn kept a table permanently reserved for Nolan at the diner, refusing payment more often than not. The hardware store had started carrying Nolan's handmade furniture on consignment, and pieces sold faster than he could make them. Most importantly, Nolan had started teaching free carpentry workshops at the community center, partnering with social services to reach at-risk youth. He shared his story openly, the job loss, the homelessness, the desperation that drove him to build the Oak House, and he taught them that hands could create futures, that skills mattered more than circumstances, that falling didn't mean staying down. One evening, sitting alone in the Oak House with the fire crackling, Nolan's phone rang. An unfamiliar number, but he'd learned to answer them now. "Mr. Reyes? My name is Wallace. I just lost my job and my apartment. I saw your story online and I don't know what to do. Can you talk?" Nolan settled into his chair, feeling the familiar weight of someone else's desperation. "I can talk. Tell me what's going on." They spoke for over an hour. Nolan offered no easy answers, no promises that things would magically improve. Instead, he talked about starting with one decision, one day, one action, about building something, not necessarily a house, but a future shaped by determination instead of circumstance. "You can't control what life takes from you," Nolan said, "but you can control what you build with what remains. Start there. Start with what you can do today, and let tomorrow worry about itself." After the call ended, Nolan sat quietly, understanding something he'd been slowly learning. His story had rippled beyond Millfield Creek, beyond the news coverage, beyond the viral videos. It had become something other people used to navigate their own storms. That responsibility felt heavy and right all at once. He opened the journal Constance had given him and wrote a final entry. "Today, someone asked me what I learned from all this. I told them you can't control what life takes from you, But you can control what you build with what remains. And sometimes what remains is exactly what you needed all along. I built the oak house thinking I was building shelter. But I was building purpose, community, proof that broken things can become beautiful. I was building myself back up, one board at a time, until I remembered who I was supposed to be. He closed the journal and placed it on the shelf next to his father's photograph. Tomorrow, Penny would arrive for the weekend. They were planning to carve a new animal for the workshop, an owl, she'd decided, because owls were wise and lived in trees. Simple plans, simple joys. Nolan stepped outside into the winter night. The great oak loomed above him, ancient and steadfast, its fallen trunk transformed into something that had saved lives and changed a community. He placed his hand on the bark, feeling its cold strength. "Thank you," he whispered to the tree, "for catching me when I fell." Stars wheeled overhead, the same stars that had watched him arrive 3 months ago with nothing but a truck and desperation. But everything had changed. He had a home, a purpose, his daughter, community, respect. More importantly, he had himself back, not the man he'd been before losing everything, but someone stronger, forged in the fire of necessity and quenched in the cold reality of starting over. Inside the oak house, the fire burned warm and steady, smoke rising straight into the winter sky. The walls stood solid against the cold, holding warmth and safety, and all the promise of tomorrow. Nolan looked at the bronze plaque one more time, then returned inside and closed the door. Outside, the forest was silent under stars and moonlight. Inside was everything that mattered, a home built from determination, filled with love, standing as proof that falling doesn't mean staying down. The oak house stood quiet and strong around him, no longer mocked, no longer doubted. A shelter that became a home, a failure that became a foundation. A man who fell and built his way back up. And in the morning, when his daughter arrived, they would continue building their future together. One careful measurement, one steady cut, one act of love at a time.